Tak jo, kamera jede, zvuk jede.
So you probably did a lot of interviews. What are the most typical things that the journalists ask you concerning your specialization, what you're doing?
Well, they ask me, I have really two specializations. It's gender, and in particular masculinities, and then criminology. So I've done interviews on both.
And how was your personal, because you do a lot of life stories, or one of your research is based on life stories. So what is your life story to be the head of the Department of Criminology and doing gender, mainly masculinities, in the connection with violence, but graduated in sociology?
So do a little bit of my life history. When I entered the university, I intended to be a veterinarian, and so I started out in what the U.S. calls pre-vet, and then I took a sociology class and took another sociology class, and after those two classes I fell in love with sociology, mainly because it was during the anti-Vietnam War time period, and I got very much involved in the anti-war movement. I actually became a member of the Young Socialists, and which in the U.S. was a Trotskyite organization, and so I was very much involved in the anti-war movement and social change, and so sociology tended to very much connect to that, and where pre-vet and natural sciences didn't. So I continued to study that with actually an emphasis on crime, and one of the reasons why I got interested in crime was because of the Nixon administration was involved in all kinds of criminal activity, and so I thought a sociological understanding of crime would be very interesting, and it turned out to be the case. And so I've studied since then white-collar forms of crime and political crimes. And then I decided to work in the criminal justice system after I graduated from the university for 2 years. I worked as what was called a reconnaissance officer, and that's an individual who lets people, newly arrested people, get out of jail without posting bail. Bail, in the U.S. is you have to put up some money so that, if you, that will allow you to get out of jail until your court date, but you give the money for the purpose of coming back, because when you come back to court and your trial is finished, then you get the money back. That's the purpose of bail. But I was an individual who got people out of jail without posting any money, just based on their connections to the community, etc. So I did that for 2 years, and it really kind of slapped me, in the face, the way the criminal justice system works, because I started to see people, the same people, over and over again. In other words, the criminal justice system in the United States, what it does is it processes the same people continuously. So I decided that I needed more education, and so I went on and got my master's degree at San Diego State, and then I decided to leave the U.S. for a while.
This is a quite interesting probably part to change the American environment and to go to Sweden.
Yeah, exactly.
And why Sweden?
Well, I was, in the California State University system, and they have a graduate student exchange program with a number of European universities. first I wanted to go to the London School of Economics. That was my first choice.
Everyone wants to, probably.
And when I applied, they decided that they had their fill of Americans. They were full up, and so they couldn't take any more Americans. And I had read a lot about Sweden at the time. You know, it was considered, and in many ways still today, is considered the welfare state. And so I wanted to experience something different from the United States. And so I was accepted. And I went there, and I wrote my master's thesis in Sweden.
In
And
Swedish.
no, in English.
In English.
Yeah, because I had to send it back to San Diego. And I ended up getting married in Sweden, and stayed there for 3 years, learned the language, and enrolled in the PhD program at the University of Stockholm, and finished my degree there. Prior to that, though, before I left for Sweden, and this is how I got really involved in feminism and gender issues, is that I started, taking graduate courses in sociology. And having numerous feminist professors turned me on to feminism. They provided lots of readings. In particular, I started to read the socialist feminists of the early or the late 1800s and the early 1900s in the United States, that started to connect back to my experiences in the anti-war movement, because that helped me to realize what was happening amongst the students organizing against the war, that it was always the men who were doing the public speaking, who were kind of having the high status in the anti-war movement, while the women, were stuffing envelopes and closing them up and doing all the hard labor. And so I started to realize things about gender division of labor and those kinds of issues. It also connected to my home life. My father, who was quite an authoritarian German, he and a patriarch. He at times could be violent, and he was violent towards my mother, and he was violent towards my brother and myself. And so it also connected to that. It helped me to understand why that was occurring, which then made me more interested in why do people become violent. And so as I progressed through my master's program and my PhD, I worked on developing kind of initially a socialist feminist perspective, and actually wrote a book, the first socialist feminist analysis of crime in criminology. It's called Capitalism, Patriarchy, and Crime. And that was, I think, my second book. My first book was on the trial of Leonard Peltier, who was a Native American activist who was wrongly convicted. I analyzed all of the trial transcripts of that case and came to the conclusion that he was wrongly convicted. And so I wrote an analysis of the trial, but which had nothing to do with gender, but the second book did. And from that book on, I've been working on gender issues. Yeah. And sometimes connecting it to criminology, sometimes just straight sociological perspectives without any crime involved. So I write on the sociology of gender and the sociology of crime, and you combine them.
You also said that you wanted to go to Sweden also because of that Sweden is the welfare state, the
Right.
like
Well,
iconic welfare
yeah,
state.
yeah.
So how it changed your more or less like American perspective, this Swedish experience, and
Mhm.
how it is now, what the impact is in your work
Well,
now? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it dramatically changed my perspective even more. I mean, I was, from the anti-war movement, I was quite critical then of the United States. But after going to Sweden, I'm even more so, because, you know, I mean, it showed me the possibilities of what humans can do in terms of taking care of each other. And, you know, from the fantastic mass transportation that exists at that time in Sweden that didn't exist in the U.S. You know, the United States is known for these individual cars driving around, right, rather than trains and underground and you know, buses, etc. I mean, it's significantly different. The free, you know, raising taxes so that everyone has a right to go to school, go to the university for free. They don't have to worry about you know, paying for education. That the entire community, you know, it's that collectivist ideology that existed in Sweden that was so different than the United States. The individualistic ideology in the United States, which you know, made me more critical of the United States, and also the politics. You know, actually Sweden, in terms of the political realm, is more democratic than the United States. You know, the United States has this two-party system, really, Democrats and Republicans, whereas in Sweden, when I was there were 5 parties represented. You know, from the conservatives to the communists, and now I think there's something like 7. I'm not positive, but so you have more representation, you know, in the parliament. So it was those kinds of things that I came in contact with that made me more critical of the United States.
So this will be the first part.
Okay.
Just sit here. We'll take a few pictures of us, just to have something to cut it in between.
Sure.
So it's better to have some material in between. For example, you need to cut something out.
All right.
So that it's better to have.
Hello.
It's better to have something. Yeah. Are you used to it, or maybe like to take pictures like that people can.
Yeah.
Nějaký synchron.
Můžete klapnout.
So we're sitting on the benches that have a lot of graffitis on. How typical is vandalism for males and specifically for youth?
It's almost exclusively males that do graffiti. I don't know about the situation in the Czech Republic, but because I haven't studied it, but I would imagine it's similar to the United States. In the United States, it's almost exclusively males, and they're actually called taggers. And what they do is it's tagging their territory. So it has very much a lot to do with masculinity, and you know, how males tend to want to control territories and be those that are in power. And so a lot of times in the United States it's associated with street gangs who tag their territory, and that's a lot what the graffiti refers to. But then there are also political taggers who just write political graffiti and are not associated with groups. But those tend to be males as well. You know, it's a public kind of activity, and you know, there's a long association between men and masculinity in the public realm. compared to women, femininity in the private realm. So, you know, in terms of gender, that kind of makes sense.
You said something about territory and about masculinity and politics also. There are political taggers. The book you are writing is on Bush and Obama.
Right.
So you said earlier to me that it's not very interesting for the media because they are probably scared of the topic. So what are you writing so scary about?
Well,
They
I
are
don't
so
think
scared.
I don't think it's scary, but the reason why they might think it's scary is because it challenges the media construction of, you know, of a president and what a president does, and in particular, it's about the war on terror discourse and how that that came about. It's, you know, the Bush-Obama chapter, it's just one chapter in the book. But what I do is I analyze, I do what sociologists call a content analysis of the speeches by both Bush and Obama, and compare them before. I'm concentrating on both of their involvements in Afghanistan and surrounding areas, not so much Iraq, because I've already written on Iraq with the first two, you know, the first Bush president and the father, and then the son, George W. Bush. That was all, you know, both of those made up an entire book. But what I'm doing now is comparing Bush Jr. with Obama regarding Afghanistan and the speeches prior to that. And what I found by looking at all their speeches is that they are very similar in the sense that they draw on this narrative of hero, victim, hero, victim, villain. And you know, they present themselves as the hero. They present the victims as the people of Afghanistan, but also people of the United States and other people in the world. And the villains are, of course, those who they define as terrorists. And so you have this kind of feminization and masculinization taking place through their discursive speeches, you know, by drawing on that narrative and then reproducing it in new form, you know, with regards to this hero, victim, and villain combination. And because the way that they describe the victims is in very feminine kinds of terms and traits, you know, that presenting all of us as really not having the capacity to engage in violence, to, you know, we don't have the capacity to protect ourselves from the villains who are the terrorists. And they are filled with all kinds of toxic traits, you know, from, you know, how horrible they are as individuals, from being evil, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And then the hero is the protector. And so that, you know, very much goes along with gender relations in the United States as well as globally in many ways. And so they reproduce in their speeches this kind of inequality. And it simultaneously, it creates this discourse of inequality, gender inequality, between men and women, between masculinity and femininity, but also among masculinities, because, you know, the terrorists are this kind of representation of toxic masculinity, and the presidents are the protector masculinities, and then the victims are the protected, you know, the feminine protected. And
now we have two boys on a skateboard. They look very American, like the American long
long baggy,
Sport, yeah.
baggy sports clothes,
So you
and
see
then
like
the hat.
the cultural colonization of also the Central Europe, but they look very American and very typical Czech doing skateboarding. So what would you now?
Well, I think that's a good example of the globalization of masculinity. And I mean, just the other night, sitting in the hotel room, and I, turned on the TV, and I was clicking through the channels, and not, of course, understanding anything unless an American program came on. But still, it was dubbed, or
It's a typical Czech thing to do.
yeah. I mean, there was not much in English at all, which was fine. I mean, I don't watch that much TV anyway, but I thought it was interesting to click through and to see, how many programs from the United States were on the TV, and I would say that probably 70% of the programs were American, pretty close to that. But also what I observed is the newscasts in the morning and in the evening were very, very similar to the way the newscasts are presented in the United States. So there's this kind of cultural adoption and influence, cultural adoption by the Czechs of American culture. And, from the news to boys in their kind of gender attire and their practices, skateboarding, which is still very much a masculine thing. And I was surprised they didn't have their hats on sideways, because we also see that in terms of race in the U.S.
It's out. Anyway,
Is it?
sideways. I don't know.
Yeah. White boys adopting kind of black masculinity forms of representation in the United States. So, I mean, the United States, being the superpower, is dramatically changing the cultures around the world.
A little bit going back to the war, the Bush and Obama. It is quite typical for masculinity to be connected with nation, with war, with military. So is it something new that Barack Obama and George Bush are doing, or the Bushes were doing, or sorry, they are calling probably. Going back to Bush, Obama, and the war on terror, is it something new? Is it some new invention? Because there are a lot of rumors, or it's said that the war on terror is specific type of war. My question would be if it is really a specific type of war, if it is still typical somehow for men and military to doing terrorism generally, because Janet McCabe, that was also a guest of the conference, she said that she lived in the 70s in London, in England. She was scared of IRA, the Irish freeing army, of the terrorism, which was the 70s, which is the similar thing that it's probably now also going on. So it is something new, something typical. It would be probably the first question, and the other question concerning is a different discourse around it, or media approach to it, or is it a marketized a different way?
Yeah, I think it is different. The United States really never experienced any terrorist acts against the United States from outside the U.S. until the 9/11. So it's quite different than Britain, the UK, in that regard. Most of the terrorism, which wasn't really defined as terrorism, occurred with internal groups like white supremacist groups, attacking gay people, attacking black people, and attacking Jews, etc. I mean, that's really the way that terrorism has been defined, and so it hasn't really been associated with war in the United States until 9/11.
And is it somehow useful to use the label war for the purposes of defining it or fighting
There
against
is,
it?
yeah, there is. I mean, it's 9/11 came at a perfect time for the Bush administration because there was this long-standing effort to, quote, do something about Saddam Hussein, who was the kind of standing in the way of access to the large oil reserves in Iraq. And if you remember, the first Bush president, actually being smarter than the junior Bush president, after he, quote, liberated Kuwait when Saddam Hussein moved into Kuwait, which was related to oil as well. The Iraqis were accusing the Kuwaitis of crossing the Iraq border and drilling, stealing Iraqi oil, and according to the Iraqis, they wouldn't stop. So that's why they invaded, and then the United States, of course, used that as an effort to show, about Saddam Hussein's evilness and his toxic masculinity, and how he was kind of bent on taking over the entire area there. But they also saw it as a threat to the oil reserves around the area. I mean, he represented this kind of instability in the arena and in that arena, and then to allow access to the oil reserves there by multinational, transnational oil companies, you have to have stability. And the Bush Sr. did kick, through the military, did kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, but refused to go in and take Saddam Hussein out as leader of Iraq, probably hoping that somehow he would maintain some kind of stability and allow access to the oil industry. But the oil industry back in, I believe it was 1972, when the Ba'ath Party first came to power in Iraq, the oil industry was nationalized in Iraq. So it didn't allow any corporations to come in and invest. But Saddam Hussein didn't maintain the oil refineries in a way he should have. He kept a lot of the profits for himself rather than reinvesting it. And so there was a massive amount of oil under the ground that still had not been discovered, and everyone knew about that. And so, the Bushes, who had very close connection to the oil industry, eventually, when George Jr. came to power, all the people surrounding him were in many ways representatives of the oil industry, and they pressed for the actual removal of Saddam Hussein. And what happened was that 9/11 occurred at the appropriate time for the Bush administration, because then they used that to actually, which we all know now, lied to the American people as well as the people around the world, that Saddam Hussein had connections to terrorist organizations, which he didn't. There were no terrorist organizations. For instance, Al-Qaeda did not exist in Iraq prior to the U.S. invasion. That he had these fantastic weapons of mass destruction that, when the U.S. troops went in and they then allowed in inspectors, there was no evidence. They couldn't find any evidence of weapons of mass destruction. And the inspectors from the United Nations who were in there prior to the U.S. invasion could not find any weapons of mass destruction. And in fact, Hans Blix, the guy from Sweden, who was head of the UN inspectors, told Bush, we want to stay here longer because we want to, we haven't been able to inspect everything. even though we haven't found anything yet, we want to finish the job. And Bush gave them something like 48 hours to get out. You know, because he probably knew that they weren't going to find anything. So he used that as, you know, creating this image that Saddam Hussein was this toxic, masculine individual who had connections to terrorists as the reason for invading, and now we know that it's all untrue. So that created the war on terror for the first time. So that's what makes it unique, and it's unique in a number of other ways compared to other wars. First of all, these terrorist organizations are not really associated with any country, whereas previous wars have always been wars between nation states or between countries. This is a war against some defined group as a terrorist, right? And you know, I mean, there's actually problems with that that term terrorism, because that's used in a very ideological way, you know, to create fear amongst, in particular, the American people, but also people around the world. For instance, Americans actually have a greater chance of being hit by lightning than they do by being killed by a terrorist, you know? And, but yet they're very fearful of terrorism, and they support the American government because of this kind of, you know, discursive presentation ongoing by now Barack Obama of, you know, we have to carry on this war on terror. And really what is happening is the U.S. occupying, you know, like you say, a colonial way, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, you know, for instance, now Obama using drones, etc. What that does is that creates more terrorism, because really what is being defined as terrorism is organizations of mostly men, not exclusively, but mostly men, who rise up really against that occupation. I mean, that's what's being defined as terrorism. You know, in sociology, there's what's called the sociology of social movements. So sociologists study social movements and why they arise. And all social movements arise because they feel that there's some kind of injustice happening in the world or happening to them. And that needs to change. For instance, the women's movement organized because women and men who were associating with them felt that there was an injustice between, you know, men and women, and that women were being, you know, receiving the negative part of that. The gay and lesbian movement, you know, now the transgender movement, you know, the environmental movement, et cetera, et cetera. So all these social movements have arisen for that reason. And it's the same thing with Al-Qaeda and now this group, ISIS and other groups. They arise because they feel that there's some injustice. And, you know, regardless of how they decide to create social change, I mean, obviously these are organizations that are dominated by males, and they construct a masculinity that is actually quite violent. To create social change and to overcome, you know, what they see as this injustice. And so that's not discussed in the discourse on the war on terror, right? That's actually covered up. And, you know, it's this presentation of, you know, somehow it's very non-sociological, right? That all of a sudden individuals appear who are quite evil, you know, without explaining what gives rise to that. I mean, they are evil in many ways, clearly. You know, the way that they use violence, but they see that as their political response to this injustice. So, you know, we can disagree with what they're doing and, you know, identify it as clearly criminal. I mean, it violates international laws, what terrorists are doing, what's identified as terrorists, what these organizations are doing. But we can also understand it. And we can understand it in a gendered way, I think.
So going back to gender, to probably last question, would a female president do something else or different based on this masculinity, how it's masculinity constructed and femininity constructed?
Well,
Would it be different?
it depends on the female, just like it depends on the male, because masculinity, just like femininity, is not exclusive to male bodies. It can also be constructed by females, and for instance, the leading candidate right now is a female, Hillary Clinton. But Hillary Clinton is what we would call, or what Americans call, hawks. You know, there are hawks and there are doves in the Senate and the House of Representatives. Doves tend to be less likely to support war and militarism, and hawks want to solve all kinds of problems through military and violence. And Hillary Clinton has a strong record of being a hawk. She strongly supported the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and she supported initially when she was Secretary of State. She differed from Obama in supporting military intervention right away into Syria when it was discovered that someone, which I guess became known as the Assad regime, using chemical weapons. So use the military to stop that use of chemical weapons. And so, you know, I don't think the war on terror is going to change just because a woman becomes president. It clearly didn't change under Thatcher in England. And so, you know, I mean, the war on terror, it serves a very strong discursive and ideological purpose. You know, it creates this fear, it creates support by Americans that, yeah, we have to be protected from these terrorists, and we need a strong, masculine president to do that. When really the reason for sending the troops and the drones and the bombers into the Middle East is to maintain a safe environment, try to create a safe environment, which they're having a very difficult time doing because they end up reproducing that terrorism in those groups, to create an environment for the exploitation of the oil under the ground.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very interesting talk.
I could have gone even further.
Yeah. I think we thank you very much. We have to go to the train.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have now 30 minutes.